Hello, folks. I'd like to invite you to another of our philosophical explorations as part of our Philosophy Salon series. And tonight we're giving a special focus to a concept that's of particular relevance to philosophy, which is basically the concept of love. If you've been following us and you watched our first salon, you'll know that we delved fairly deeply into the definition of philosophy, and we unpack that in some depth. And part of that definition, of course, if you know what the meaning of philosophy is the concept of love, because philosophy in essence is the love of wisdom. So if you're going to develop a better appreciation and understanding of what philosophy is, I think a natural starting point is to kind of dissect that, all the components of that definition, and analyze each of the individual concepts that are a part of that definition. So love would probably be the starting point in some sense, because a philosopher loves wisdom. So I think, Ryan, we should probably see if we can get clear on what that exactly means. It's a fairly rich concept, and there's not a single definition of love as the Greeks understood the word. And so I think it's good to distinguish between the various sorts of love that the Greeks talked about and see which of those most apply to philosophy. And I thought a natural starting point would probably be one of those more influential concepts and definitions that the Greeks used, and that was Eros. And basically, Eros is a concept which pertains to that aspect of love which connects things, which brings things together, which unifies things. And so we'll get clear on exactly what we mean by this as we go along. But I thought a good starting point might be some of the earliest discussions of Eros in Western canon, starting with Hesiod's account in his Theogony. And in his Theogony, it's basically just a big myth on the beginning of the cosmos. He talks about the cosmos emerging from, all of these divine forces coming together. And basically, all of what we know as the primordial Greek gods came out of sort of an original union between Gaia and Uranus. And from them, all the other primordial gods came to be, as well as all other living organisms in the cosmos, or just entities more generally, rocks and mountains and the water and space and what have you. But you might be wondering, where does love enter into this picture? And basically, love enters at the point where Gaia and Uranus come together, because they come together to procreate and to give birth to all the gods and all the life forms and all the entities in the cosmos. So Eros is that force which brings the two together. The function of Eros is this unifying force in this particular myth. And that gives us some clue as to what Eros might mean if we're kind of going to look at it maybe more conceptually and in more philosophically. But at this stage, Eros is that force, or in the case of this myth, he's actually a god who brings things together. He brings Gaia and Uranus together, Gaia being the feminine principle and Uranus being the masculine principle. Eros is the unifier of these two principles, and out of which we have the beginnings of life and the evolution of the cosmos. Now, I might just briefly go over how Hesiod describes Eros in that passage, because I think it provides maybe a bit more detail as to what his function was as a god. So he's described by Hesiod as being handsome, most handsomest of the immortals, and he's described as breaking the limb's strength, and as overpowering the intelligence of a human being. And so I think these various descriptions kind of suggest too that Eros is this force which can take possession of somebody or something, and override, say, just cold and calculating rationality, and take hold of that person. And how does that affect that person's behavior once they've been affected by Eros? I think this may be an interesting question we can examine. So at this stage, Ryan, I'm just trying to figure out exactly what Eros is. I mean, as far as Hesiod is describing Eros, and how does, to what extent does he play a role in shaping the cosmos, and in to what extent is there any relevance to philosophy at this point? Something we can maybe ponder.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of unity strikes me as something interesting, like an interesting concept. So when I think about philosophy, oftentimes I think of sort of unifying principles, something that brings everything together into something intelligible. But at the same time, I also see the passage where it says it overpowers intelligence. So in some way, like I can see philosophy sort of being something of the passions as well. I'm not sure if that's something that we can relate to it. But, for me, I'm largely interested in things like existential philosophy, for instance. And as you mentioned, this concept of Eros kind of goes beyond that cold, calculating way of thinking. So yeah, it does speak to me in a certain sense. But I'm not sure it's maybe the most relevant concept for understanding philosophy. I think there's elements in there that are important. But I think as we go through some of the other principles, we're going to get or the other definitions of love, we're going to get a better picture, a more unified picture, maybe.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I think the idea of unification is quite important, especially when it comes to sort of the feminine principle and the masculine. I think that sheds some light on philosophy, but I'm interested kind of to see more what some of the other philosophers have to say about this.
Right. Yeah, I know. I mean, I think you've underscored some interesting themes here, that I think Eros here is being depicted as a unifier, a bringing together of the gods who are responsible for the genesis of the cosmos. So Eros in this passage is kind of an orchestrator of the coming together of the cosmos, the bringing together of the procreative masculine, feminine principles. And so I think that's interesting, how this translates into how we better understand philosophy. think I can kind of see in some senses how it might relate. I think
Yeah.
the philosopher is naturally attracted to or drawn to wisdom, theory, and practical principles too. So we might say the philosopher is in some sense maybe possessed by Eros. He's possessed by his passion to pursue wisdom, that overrides maybe even his rational faculties. His maybe that might relate to his mental functioning and more cognitive functioning. We typically kind of view philosophers, in some sense at least, as kind of being champions of reason, and we view them as kind of being totally. Depends on the philosophers we're talking about, of course, but when it comes to thinking of the Greeks, some people kind of think of them as just kind of being hyper rational, which I think might be a misconception. And as we go along, I think it'll probably be revealed to us that the Greeks were actually quite balanced between, the erotic and more of the logical and rational sides of their nature.
I guess it kind of depends on what we mean by intelligence. Sometimes, I think love, in the sense that we're understanding here, can overpower some of our other instincts, some instincts that are maybe more rational to follow in certain circumstances. So again, I think it also depends on how we understand intelligence in this sense, because it says, it's an energy which seems capable of overpowering intelligence. So what do we mean by intelligence? I mean, that's kind of up for debate. I'm also curious what you think about philosophy. Is it more of a creative endeavor, or is philosophy something that we discover? Are we discovering principles, or are we creating principles? Because if we're viewing it from more of a creative perspective, the act of philosophy can almost be seen as this sort of unification of this more rational, perhaps masculine side of ourselves, and the more feminine, maybe creative side. So it's not something that's purely rational, but it's also not something that's purely, guided by, the passions either. Right. Maybe it's some sort of unification of these in some sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a good point you've made there, because you're now bringing this back to, human nature and human psychology. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that, we have this dual nature in some sense, where we're rational beings, but we're also passional beings. And it would seem that Eros reconciles these two aspects of our nature. And maybe by doing so, we become fully integrated with our rational and passional nature, so that we're fully functioning in unison with those parts of ourselves. Because you'll observe in certain people, I guess, they're excessively rational, and they put a lopsided importance on their rationality, and they're always trying to see the logic in everything and make sense of everything logically, and they want precise statistics, and they want to have they want to know the probabilities of certain outcomes, and they're striving for certainty maybe, and then on the other hand, you have maybe people who are excessively passional in nature, and they're very feely and they're very intuitive, and everything's kind of fuzzy, and there's lots of ambiguity and
I kind of bring this back to, Apollo and Dionysus,
sure. I mean, you can always bring it back to them because, I think they're good representations of these aspects of our natures. Then maybe they're not simply that. Maybe they're archetypes too that might have an independent existence. Maybe they're daemons or something that take possession of us, like Eros seems to. But I think it's a useful principle, and it's one which I think can explain how these two aspects of our nature can become unified. And I think in some sense, it's a healthy unification because just viewing things kind of as in a balanced way, I think we, if proper human functioning is kind of a balance of the forces within us, I think Eros has the ability to create that balance between reason and passion, so that neither is too excessive or even deficient for that matter. I think I can kind of see these as being kind of operating together and in kind of an equilibrium state, so that each is kind of affecting our behavior in ways that are adaptive and which are in congruence with the truth and just the philosophical wise way of living, I suppose. But I mean, we're opening up a pretty big can of worms there, and we could definitely go pretty far down that rabbit hole. But it's a thread we can return to. I thought it might be interesting to maybe shift to the next thinker that we were going to discuss, Aristophanes. And he provides another early account of Eros in Western literature. And Aristophanes was, I believe, a Greek playwright. And in his play, The Birds, he provides an overview of Eros. And again, it's another cosmology. It's another story of how the cosmos came to be. And in his account, it's somewhat different from Hesiod's, but also there are some similarities as well. But in this account, we have a coming together of what Aristophanes describes as the night and the dark. And these two, call them forces or call them gods or what have you. These two forces come together and they give birth to Eros. So it's somewhat different from the first account. So in the first account, we have Eros bringing these two gods together, Uranus and Gaia, and then the cosmos is born. In this case, we have Eros being the product of the coming together of the night and the dark. So I find that's kind of an interesting difference. And so what we have going on here is we have a sexual union, and basically love comes into being. So after this original, union between night and dark, love comes into being, and then once love comes into being, love takes over that procreative function and serves as the progenitor and procreator of everything that exists in the cosmos. And in Aristophanes' play, I guess the birds have some kind of priority. So the birds are actually given birth to before the actual primordial gods, and then the primordial gods come into being. And again, though, I think this verse gets at the core idea, which is the function of Eros. The function of Eros is to unify or to marry things together, either kind of in the celestial realm or in the terrestrial realm. And as a result of this unification, this well, in Aristophanes' account, love well, I shouldn't say it's just love, but love comes together with chaos. That's something I kind of glossed over there. Love comes together with chaos, and then they give birth to the birds and then the primordial gods. But again, so the key theme would be that there still is this unitive force operating in the cosmos. In this case, it's love and chaos coming together. So I find that to be interesting. Thoughts at all, Ryan?
Definitely less familiar with Aristophanes. I mean, a little bit through Nietzsche. I remember learning a bit about him, but I think this idea of love and chaos. I mean, I think it seems to be obviously like derivative, almost kind of. I think it's representing some sort of archetype. Maybe not derivative, but maybe derivative of some similar archetype that people are trying to get at. It seems that people are using different metaphors or analogies to get at this, but it seems to be representing some sort of fundamental dichotomy that's present maybe in our psychology or maybe even within philosophy, because I mean it seems like a lot of philosophy grew out of these playwrights, these famous playwrights like Aristophanes. A lot of philosophers really kind of looked at these playwrights to gain a lot of their ideas. And in some sense, I mean, you look at Plato, their dialogues, they're almost like plays, right? But I think maybe even like someone like Aristophanes with his plays, like it's almost like a way of communicating these philosophical ideas that marries these sort of concepts. It's not sort of like you read Plato's dialogues and they're just kind of, I mean, there's some humor here and there, but I find them kind of like dry and boring.
Right.
So when I think of Aristophanes, probably because of Nietzsche, I think of this sort of marriage of wisdom and like, but conveying it in a way that's not sort of dry,
right?
Not devoid of passion. There's some very insightful wisdom in there, but it has its chaos. You think of these Greek tragedies or these comedies, right? And that's sort of what comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a classicist by any means. I've read a handful of classical literature. I've read some Homer. I've read some of the playwrights, and I guess in the case of Euripides here.
Are we talking about Euripides or Aristophanes?
Oh, sorry. I'm confusing my playwrights, Aristophanes.
I just wanted to make sure I didn't go off on a complete tangent. That was.
I think it's the fact that all of these Greek playwrights, all of their names end with an es at the end. So.
Yeah.
But in any case, yeah. Thanks for correcting me there.
I thought I was correcting myself, to be honest.
But Aristophanes, I mean, what I hear you saying is there's something you get in a epic poem or myth that you don't get in, say, a philosopher like Plato, even in the dialogues. You get a dryness. In Plato, you get a dryness, you get an abstractness. You get an analysis of what a concept means, what the definitions of something are. Even though I must admit, and maybe I have a dry sense of humor, but I always get a bit of a laugh, reading Plato's dialogues and Socrates ranting on and on about this and that. And, I think there's some humor to be had there, but
You have to be a philosophy student though to find the humor, to be honest.
No, I think so. I think what getting like in a playwright like Aristophanes is you're getting a bit of that passional part of philosophy. I think what poetry does in some sense is it evokes the passions. And just when I was reading through that passage of Aristophanes in preparation for this conversation, it did evoke some emotion, it did evoke some passion. It goes beyond the literal, it goes beyond the linear or the logical sometimes, and it kind of appeals to your imagination. It stirs up images and emotions that are evoked by those images. And what images and emotions that are evoked by me when I read through this passage is kind of envisioning what these procreative forces might have been, like as because they're almost personified in some sense, as people, you have a coming together of love and chaos in this procreative union. So they're, it's almost like a marriage of male and female again.
Yes.
In this sexual procreative union, and then out of love and chaos is the rest of the cosmos is born. The birds, and then the primordial gods, and then everything else in between. And so I think that's why, in some sense, too, it's good to go over these myths and these poems, because I think it gives you an appreciation of that part of philosophy, that more passional part of it. At the same time, though, this is not exclusively just appealing to your emotions, but there is too a logic to it. Different cause and effect being kind of trying to be explained in terms of these principles, these personifications.
I think too, I mean, one of the points that you hit home on is like what the verse is really trying to express is, I think, you're saying it's like a way of marrying all celestial and terrestrial beings, and in previous conversations, you've kind of mentioned this in passing, I think, about how oftentimes the way that a society or a culture sort of arranges its gods are in some way a mirror image to us and our relations that we have together. So I think that's perhaps an important way of understanding philosophy. If we're taking philosophy as sort of a tool to understand the world, this maybe perhaps like this in and of itself kind of thing. I think ultimately there is this tendency, even now, maybe not in this sort of, I guess we could call primitive manner of talking about gods, but this sort of almost projection of ourselves onto the world and onto the inner workings of the world.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point you bring up there. What I hear you saying is we might have just an inborn tendency to personify nature, to project our own. Maybe should I even say personalities? We might project our own personality onto nature, and therefore view nature in personal terms. Whether we're describing it as Gaia or Uranus, we're describing these gods that have masculine and female characteristics, just like a person would, and not even just male and masculine female and masculine characteristics, but also just personality qualities. I'm sure some of these gods, like if you look at the Olympian gods, I don't know so much about the primordial gods like Gaia and Uranus, but if you look at Zeus and Hera and Ares and Apollo, they're very human in nature, and they have their foibles, and they get into arguments with each other, and um, so maybe that's kind of addressing this tendency we have to personify nature and personify things. At the same time, though, I would like to entertain the idea possibly too that maybe that's something just beyond our individual psyches, our individual projections on the universe. But maybe it's something that's part of the universe itself.
Mhm.
Maybe the nature is personal in some sense. Maybe these gods are kind of like archetypes of the collective unconscious. We can tune into these archetypes with our brains. If our brains are like receivers, of information rather than generators of information, then maybe we're tuning into these archetypal energy fields or something, and maybe these gods in that sense then do interact with us. Maybe we tune into Eros, and then Eros takes possession of us, and then suddenly we're filled with passion, and we're inspired, and we're ready to write a novel, or build the Parthenon or something.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
I see it, for me anyways, I see it as just sort of expressing that, whichever way you want to view it, there's ultimately this marriage of ourselves and the world, whichever way you want to interpret that, whether it's, purely a material world that you believe in, or one that, goes beyond simply the material world. And whether that's simply a limitation of us, it's that way because that's all we have in terms of, our physical apparatus, and our biology, or whether like you said, like it is that way because the universe is that way and we're part of it.
right, or maybe it's both too.
Maybe it's
That's something to entertain. I don't know the answer to this riddle myself, but I can only speak to what my experience has shown me to be accurate or true. As tentative as that truth might be, but in any case, we could talk all night about this. I thought it might be good to maybe shift to our next series of thinkers here, maybe beginning with the pre-Socratics, starting with Heraclitus. And Heraclitus has, I think the interesting transition you see when we shift into the pre-Socratic philosophers, moving from the mythological thinkers like Hesiod and Aristophanes, is you're starting to see a shift away from the personification of these forces. Eros being personified as this handsome god that takes possession of beings and overcomes their reason. You're seeing you're seeing these concrete personifications become abstract concepts in some sense, and being understood through the natural phenomena itself without any kind of personal qualities attached to it. So in the case of Heraclitus, he understands love or eros as a force that comes into this antagonistic relationship with another force within the universe, which he refers to as feud or strife. And according to Heraclitus, these two forces are at perpetual war with each other. So it's a relationship of mutual aggression between love and strife. And each is trying to invade the domain of the other. And what's interesting here, though, is that this invasion between these two forces involves this kind of reconciliation, this marriage. And out of this marriage between these two forces, the rest of the cosmos emerges. So just to maybe be a little more precise, when love and strife come together in combination with all of the other raw materials of the universe, as it were, all of the elements. It's the combination of these this of love and of strife and all of the raw materials in the universe all come together and they give birth to the universe or the cosmos. So the heavens emerge out of this process and earth emerges out of this process of this marriage between love and strife. And so, here we have similar themes as to what we've already gone over with mythological thinkers. But we have, they're no longer described as having personal qualities in some sense, right? They're more just like forces of nature, or they're like laws of nature, abstracted away from the any kind of concrete personification. So yeah, but I think we're getting kind of somewhat more of the same here, maybe expressed in slightly different terms, and maybe I'll just, because I want to get into talking about this, and I don't want to. I want to kind of get to Empedocles, because I think he says some really interesting things, and some things that are quite similar to Heraclitus. So I think maybe we could take up Heraclitus as we take up Empedocles, perhaps.
Sure. I do just have one quick
Sure.
thing to say about it, which is like when I think of this love and versus strife, I think of the laws of thermodynamics. An entropy versus its opposite, which I had to Google here very quickly. It's negentropy,
Okay.
which is this coming together, basically order.
Right.
Sort of like when I think of the world, it's like kind of that chaos, back to that chaos and love thing, that it's the world of constantly battling between order and sort of harmony and peace, and then periods of chaos and things falling apart.
Right. Yeah, actually, that's a good way of articulating it. I hadn't thought about it in those terms.
And when I think of love, it's like us trying to make order out of the chaos, through wisdom. Like that's kind of what I would take if I were to try to apply Heraclitus to philosophy, that love of wisdom.
Right. Yeah. Well, it would seem to that has particular relevance to theoretical wisdom, because theoretical wisdom, which the Greeks refer to as Sophia, it's that aspect of wisdom in which we try to make sense of everything in the cosmos. We try to make sense of, the blooming, buzzing confusion around us. All of these things that we perceive around us. Without the aid of our ability to think, and to reason, and to organize our perceptions through our ideas and through the theories that we can come up about how things came to be.
One can only imagine too the level of strife that these people were, at odds with back in these times, right? Back before most modern technologies were ever even conceived of. Constantly battling that.
Yeah, so maybe that made them particularly keen observers of these forces operating in nature, because they were so in close proximity to it. Like they couldn't, they didn't have you know, they didn't live in, huge cities where, they were encased in concrete walls and skyscrapers, and, they were close to nature. They were observers of nature. They were in tune with nature, and as such, they were exposed probably equally to strife and to love. If we're going to understand these more in kind of scientific terms, as scientific principles or laws or even habits of the universe, maybe even. I think that makes them that's probably why they have such, I think, good accounts of the forces that brought the cosmos together. But in any case, yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Laws of thermodynamics kind of map onto this distinction between love and strife. That's pretty interesting. I think that just goes to show too how important the pre-Socratic philosophers are, as far as anticipating a lot of these later scientific discoveries. Maybe just to continue where we were, to get back to the main thread. The next thinker I wanted to cover briefly is Parmenides. And Parmenides, from my own reading of him and with my own understanding, he only has a brief verse where he mentions Eros, and it's from one of his fragments. But according to Parmenides, Eros was the first of all of the gods, basically, and so love has for Parmenides, love has a primacy. Love is the first on the scene in some sense. I don't know. We just have fragments of him, so I don't know what exactly his views on love were, whether they were similar to Heraclitus's. They very well could have been, given all of the continuities we've seen from Hesiod on to Heraclitus at this stage. So maybe we can just presume that love occupies a similar place in his cosmological scheme of the universe. Maybe that's something we can return to if I come across any more of Parmenides that can maybe address that concern. Then we can come back to that for a future conversation. But in any case, the next philosopher I wanted to mention in this historical sequence is Empedocles. And I think Empedocles really had some detailed and elaborate views on what Eros was, what love was, and somewhat in keeping with Heraclitus, Empedocles views the universe as coming out of this opposition between these opposing forces of love and of strife. And he kind of articulates it in somewhat more detailed terms, which I find pretty interesting. But for him, the universe is born of this opposition between love and strife. And in some sense, all of the natural elements, earth and fire and I forget. Let's see. Oops, in any case,
4 elements, I believe. Yeah.
4 elements. They basically these two forces interacted with the 4 elements. I think there was earth, water, fire,
Air.
and air. Yeah, that's right. And so these forces they basically brought the elements together, and out of the elements, the combinations of elements, the whole universe came to be.
Just think of your Pokemon, when you're.
Yeah, Pokemon, right? That's a footnote to Empedocles right there.
Yeah.
But yeah, out of the four elements, and out of the interplay of love and of strife came the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we have love and strife kind of playing similar roles as they did in the previous thinkers. Love again is this maybe more explicitly in Empedocles. It's this attractive force. It's like this force of attraction that's bringing everything together. Strife is this force of separation and division that's separating everything apart.
Mm-hmm.
So I find that pretty interesting. It almost, for me, I'm kind of like thoughts that come to mind and ways of understanding this that come to mind are kind of like magnetic forces or gravitational fields, binding things together. And then of course, there's the forces that separate as well. So those are repulsive forces.
I immediately think of one of the first philosophers we get introduced to typically, which is Aristotle. I was reading a bit down in some of these passages about where is it here? It's a little bit later on. At different times they come to be different things, and yet are always and continuously the same. In some sense, love almost represents, what Aristotle referred to as form, right. And strife or chaos, or however these philosophers want to conceive it, is sort of like the raw, chaotic, indifferent stuff. That stuff that matter, I guess Aristotle refers to it as the thing that makes things change in a certain sense. Right. I see it almost predating sort of Aristotle's way of conceiving the universe or the world.
Right. Yeah. In some sense, that makes sense to me. I think, again, I think a lot of the great philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, in some sense, they were significantly influenced by the pre-Socratic philosophers. To the concept of form, in some sense that form seems to be a force that is maybe shaped out of these opposing forces in some sense, it's almost as if you want to think of it in terms of like fields, or morphogenetic fields, my entire body might have a morphogenetic field that gives us its form, and maybe there are some attractive forces which serve to, as my body developed biologically, there were attractive forces kind of leading my body on to this to form this final end state, which is me as an organism. If that makes any sense at all.
Mm-hmm. There's a few parts that you have highlighted here that I think are pretty interesting and relate back to our conversation on happiness too, perhaps.
Right.
About interchanging in a circle and this sort of notion of a vortex. Right. This sort of interplay between strife or hardship and sort of love, happiness in some sort of sense, in order to be whole, in order to be complete as sort of like a human being, to experience eudaimonia. or to achieve eudaimonia, perhaps. It's sort of this, it requires this interplay between these two forces.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I think so. I mean, I think we often, like if we're thinking of terms of eudaimonia and achieving happiness, that striving towards happiness is in some sense, I think it's a kind of a force of attraction in some ways. When we're pursuing a desired goal, I think feels like there's almost something pulling us towards it in some sense. And to what extent does strife come into play? I'm not entirely sure.
I think back to our previous conversation on nonlinear change, this idea of strife in our lives, hardship, and just is sort of, in some sense, fundamental to who we are as human beings. So perhaps this idea of Eros or of love is really integral to, understanding what it means to be a happy person, or that's sort of that unifying principle in some sense.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure, maybe we could come back to that maybe in a fuller conversation, but it's just something that popped to mind as I was reading this passage yesterday.
Right.
That it for some reason it seems to mirror that sort of relationship.
Yeah, no, I think it's a valid point you bring up here. It's something we can definitely return to. There's a lot to digest here, and we could possibly just continue this conversation in our next dialogue we have with each other. I'm happy to pick it up again back at Empedocles, and because after Empedocles we get into Plato, and if we get into Plato now, I feel like we could be going for another hour.
You're not wrong. Yeah, Plato, I think, has quite a bit to say about Eros and has a lot of historical implications as well. Freud and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I'm happy to delve back into this discussion in our next dialogue. Maybe we can bring things to summary.
Yeah.
So we've looked at the concept of love in terms of Eros. We've been trying to get to a clearer understanding and definition of what Eros is exactly. I guess at this point, we looked at Empedocles, we looked at Hesiod, and we saw it as this unifying force of the gods, as we saw in Aristophanes, and then in Heraclitus, we also saw it as this unifying force. But now the unifying force is kind of understood in more naturalistic terms, in terms of these kind of forces of attraction and repulsion that are in perpetual conflict with one another, and when they come together, they give birth to the universe. And then we have a similar type of understanding in Empedocles. Parmenides didn't really have a whole lot to say there, but we can maybe assume that he had similar ideas and thoughts. And now I think for our next conversation, we can kind of pick up the thread from where we left off and talk about Plato, his understanding of what Eros was, and maybe we can notice some other similarities between the previous thinkers, maybe some new and original ideas with him as well. But I guess if I were to sum up what my current understanding of Eros is, it seems to be this attractive force. Maybe it's a force that's part of the cosmos, or maybe that's bringing things together. And maybe it's also part of our psychology, part of our psychological makeup. Maybe we naturally are attracted to certain things, certain passions we have, whether it's philosophy or other pursuits, or even people, sexually, on a sexual level, we're attracted to people. And in some sense, we're overtaken by these passions. We get really, if we're into philosophy, we get really obsessed with an idea, and we're always just thinking about reality in those in terms of these ideas. Or if it's physical attraction, we're very attracted and drawn to a particular person, and it kind of takes possession of you in that sense, or whatever else, whatever else kind of example we want to concoct. How about you? I mean, how do you make sense of Eros at this point?
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of the points. In terms of how it relates to philosophy, in terms of the love of wisdom, I think that concept of unity or attraction, or this concept of, because in each philosopher that we've talked about, it plays some sort of unifying or attracting, ordering role. And I think that's probably key to philosophy in some sense or another. And I also like the sense in which you talk about how it kind of like takes us over, because I think about, especially back in my early days of philosophy, when you would be really enamored and attracted to someone's philosophy, and it does really almost take you over, and you get almost unified with that person and that way of thinking. It almost, takes you over in a certain sense. It's like you're embodying something that's beyond yourself. You're taking part of something that's beyond yourself. It's almost controlling you in a way. You see the world differently. So I think that's, definitely important to understanding philosophy, how it's experienced, perhaps. So yeah, the concept of unity, I think, is really central to understanding what philosophy is.
Right. Yeah, no, I think you summed it up pretty accurately. One thing too, that kind of an idea that you just sparked off to, was this idea of the union between the knower and the known. Insofar as we're trying to know the world and understand it. I think that activity in of itself is a marriage, I suppose, of your own mind with the reality which you're trying to understand.
We're almost trying to solve some sort of strife going on, and we're that sort of the known, in a sense, is, we're kind of marrying ourselves, that strife with some sort of philosophy or idea of the world, maybe to, in some sense, sedate ourselves, or in a way of like drugging ourselves against the chaos, perhaps.
Yeah, possibly. It's interesting. I mean, the activity of knowing, in some sense, we're perceiving reality and we're conceptualizing it, and so in some sense, we're taking this unified field or whatever, and we're kind of understanding. We're trying to understand it into separate categories, and to dividing it into separate entities, and so on and so forth. So it's this kind of, even with this activity of wanting to know things, is wanting to kind of experience this union with the cosmos through knowing it. But at the same time, we experience that too by kind of separating ourselves in some sense, like separating, understanding reality in terms of like particular elements and so on and so forth. We need, in some sense, to to make sense of the chaos, we need to conceptualize it into distinct categories of things and so on and so forth. So there's kind of at the same time there's a unity, but there's a separate, there's kind of a I don't know if I'm putting this intelligibly.
Yeah, I feel what you're saying. It's hard to articulate, but in order to make sense of things, sometimes you have to separate them.
Yes.
You have to separate and distinguish between things in order to have some sort of unified view of the world. You have to separate the world into concepts and put things into boxes. So you have to almost I can't think of the word, but
well, yeah, there's this, let's say the reality is like this undivided unity, and then when we conceptualize it, put it into categories, into separate categories, and so on and so forth, we're in some sense, creating a partial representation of that unity. So we're only homing in on one part of that reality, and we're excluding all of the rest. So in that sense, that more of just a part of the reality comes to the foreground, through our conceptual understanding of it, and we exclude certain other parts of it that are always there, but just because the way we're conceptualizing it, only certain things are coming to the foreground.
You kind of have to do that to make sense of anything, right? You have to make some sort of generalization and exclusions.
I suppose so, yeah. So, there again, I think is the interplay between, say, the attractive force. The attractive force maybe might attract us to knowing the world. And then the separating force is what allows us to, break down the world into intelligible concepts, in some sense. In any case, we could go down this wormhole and probably talk for hours at end. But I guess we've summed our views up pretty succinctly, I think. We've covered a lot. And I think at this point, we can maybe just close, hopefully with a better understanding of what Eros is. And we can pick up this thread next time we have a chat, and maybe begin again with finishing off Empedocles, and then shifting to Plato, and seeing how they conceptualized Eros, and seeing if that lends itself to us better understanding Eros's relevance to understanding what philosophy is, insofar as philosophy is the love of wisdom. So on that note, maybe we'll sign off for now. So thanks for tuning in, everybody. And we will pick up that thread where we left off. Cheers.